think people are here. I think we're just waiting for a couple more to get admitted. Uh, it is a bit weird talking to a blank screen, but I wanted to thank everyone for joining me today to talk about reeds. I wanted to kind of start. There's a variety of tools we can use to work on reeds, and uh, I think it's just important to talk about what's available to us and the easiest way to work on reeds and maintain them. And reeds can last forever. You know, I have a reed in here that, is this it? I have been playing since the summer of 2017. I played it in August in an orchestra concert outside for a Pops concert, and it's still working. So I think it's important to talk about breaking in reeds and working on them and adjusting them so that they work best for us. So I just wanted to start by talking about just the tools we have for working on reeds. And for that, I thought I would switch cameras really quickly. Okay. So here on my desk, I have a variety of tools that we use for reed work. I guess I'm going to start on the far end, picking them up. We just have a variety of reed knives. And these are older reed knives that I've had, and then various thin or pointy files, flat files, like I don't know if you can see that, triangular files that have been used, you know, on reed work that I've been advised at various points in my studies and uses to have. I even have here a straight razor edge that many of you see, because at some point I was told that the best way to make the right reed shape was like you're cutting the tip on an oboe or bassoon reed and to shape it. Needless to say, it's neither particularly effective for me. By the time I got good at it, I destroyed so many reeds, I don't think it would have ever saved me money. And it was still too difficult. But I found that at some point, a good reed knife, you know, this is not a single bevel, this is a double bevel, can be a really good tool. And at least for, if there's any professors out there, I'm sure every single one of you, if you have ever used a reed knife, has at some point had a reed knife confiscated when you flew through an airport, or you were traveling to a gig and you just get to the airport and you left your reed knife in your saxophone case and it was confiscated. Or sometimes, perhaps scarier, it wasn't confiscated. I don't know. But then you show up and you don't have the tool you want to work on your reeds. So I just kind of want to talk about basic tools that I now use and can be effective depending on what you have. And I think, you know, a decent reed knife can be had, and we can really use any kind of pocket knife if you have to for reed work. But one thing that I've used to flatten reeds, that it's been used for kind of one of these bigger flat files, and this is not as big as some people have, but as you can see, this is a large object to keep in your kit, to be bringing around. And while it is perfectly fine for making sure that the back of a reed is flat, I got the size I was told, and then I was told I needed to buy others for different, you know, to keep the back of the reed flat. It works, but it's too big for me. And there are a couple other ways that we can keep reeds flat. Where's the piece of paper? And I'm going to talk about those now. One, the basic function of the reed is that it must close against the mouthpiece. That when we have a mouthpiece, the reed should be sitting flat against the table, And as it closes, I don't know if this is in focus at all, it will seal and it will be vibrating, opening and closing very rapidly. Now, if the reed is not balanced, if part of the reed is stiffer, instead of just closing, it kind of goes like that, and it'll still work depending on how bad it is. It may chirp, it may do any various other things, or if it has some warping along where the window was, it will maybe give you a fuzzy sound. If it's warped along the back, it it just never will work quite as you want it to. So if you're playing something just loud and it doesn't really matter, and your entrances kind of, I don't want to say they don't matter, but if you just have loud entrances and easy to play registers and that's all you ever have to do, then it doesn't always make a huge difference. But at some point, if you have to play really, really, really loud, any type of imperfection in that reed or warping of that reed will prevent you from doing um, or playing as loudly or playing as well as you can. So from just the most basic kind of things, and I don't know how many of you saw Dr. Page's reed work video where he talked about breaking in reeds. I think it was very good, and I'm going to switch cameras again to show this. Um, so he talked about taking the vamp, and when it's wet, this reed is not wet, but kind of just rubbing it, kind of pushing the fibers back in, closing the pores. So the first time you put a reed in water, even in about, if it's lukewarm water, maybe 10, 15 seconds at most, it's going to soak up a lot of water. But as your reed breaks in, if you've closed the pores, you can put it in there for a minute or two and it'll get wet, but it's not going to absorb and swell the same way that a new reed would. But if we take a reed, and by the way, I just played this reed this morning, so it's not pretty flat, totally flat, but I can feel where it absorbed water and is no longer polished. You can just take a piece of paper, and right now I'm actually on a piece of totally flat glass designed for mouthpiece work. On this desk is probably flat enough for most of this, and if you don't have something totally flat, there are other things we can do, but any general flat surface will probably be good enough, at least for this portion, where the idea is we're just taking it, and the paper is essentially acting in a way as very fine sandpaper, and we are just holding, I don't know if you can see, I guess my camera's on the wrong side, I'm holding with 3 fingers over the tip, the heel, and right at the start of the vamp, and I'm just going back and forth and polishing, pushing the fibers back into the reed, and now the base of the reed is much smoother. And in fact, I don't know if the light will catch this. Let me see if I can add this other light. I hope I don't blind you. No, it won't. But as you do it, you will eventually see that the entire back of the reed, when it's angled for, I don't know if this is gonna, it will start getting shiny. And it'll be even if the reed is flat. But this is just a first step. And the other thing you can do is you can just take a piece of paper and on the other side, just push it in. I use a piece of paper too, just because, varyingly your hands may not be totally clean, or I think the paper works a little bit better as like a super fine sandpaper to kind of polish the top and edge of the reed. This is just some very basic maintenance. Let's say you have basically nothing else to use. You can have a piece of lined paper. You can have a piece of printer paper. You can have anything that you're doing to just be rubbing the table and vamp of the reed to kind of polish it. Now, the tools I've ended up using for the past, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, I don't remember how long, 8 years, 9? It's been a very long time, are ReedGeeks. And part of the reason is that, at least where I live in LA, is that if I were to bring any one of those reed knives into a school, depending on the school, you could be in a lot of trouble because a lot of them you have to walk through metal detectors for. But also, I had flown for concerts, and I arrived and I had my reed knife confiscated, and I arrived and I left LA at, I don't know, 12% humidity and arrived in South Korea in the middle of the summer, and it was 95, 100% humidity, something like that. And so all my reeds, and I brought different strengths, but none of them played correctly. Fortunately, my reed knife had been confiscated, but I forgot I had left a ReedGeek in the outside section of my saxophone case that I didn't know was there, so I could still work on reeds. But the advantage of a ReedGeek is just that it can travel anywhere. It can go on planes. You'll always have it with you. This is a bullet, but even the regular one is about the same size. The other two I have on the table here, I have a double geek and a universal special, I think they're called. And you can unscrew it. And the regular, just like a black diamond, is about the same size as this. I don't know if you can see these two. They're about the same size. But it's got just a 90-degree angle edge, and so you can do everything you need to without actually carrying a knife with you with a ReedGeek. And part of it's just flattening it, and I don't know if you can see this. Can we see the kind of just slightly buildup of material there? But we have that, and I'm going to switch back over because I think this might be easier to see on this one. So as I'm scraping, and you can do longer strokes or shorter strokes, but both ways, we just want to hold it at about 20 degrees and flatten the reed. And I can tell you this reed was pretty flat, not totally flat. And just depending on what reed you're using, it'll be flat. I had also played this one just before this morning. These are brand new reeds. And this one, I don't know if we can hear it. There's a sound when it's perfectly flat, and then there's a sound, it kind of catches, and you just feel it, and then there's just some dust that's left over. This reed was fairly flat. And honestly, this is about 90% of what reed work is for me, is before I play on any given day, is just making sure my reeds are flat, because that way, at least if the back is flat, I know it's going to be vibrating properly, even if I haven't touched anything else on my reed. And I generally do this before I've ever played them the first time. And then I try not to work on them the second or third time. I just kind of play them, but at least with a ReedGeek, but I will use paper and polish the bottom. And part of the reason is that I want to get used to vibrating properly. And so if the reed is at all warped, it's not going to do that. And so sometimes I think I have a bad reed, and it turns out it is just warped more than others. But once I've flattened and polished it, it turns out to be a quite decent reed. So that's how we work on that. Now, if you want to figure out if your reed is flat or not, I'm just grabbing my mouthpiece. There are tools, and if you use a ReedGeek or something like this, or just a very thin measuring gauge, and when you drop it in between the tip of the mouthpiece and the reed, hold this there. Well, I can tell you with absolute certainty that this reed is not flat because it's not stopping. And it'll want to do something like that, which tells me that this reed is definitely not flat. Let's see if it focuses in. There we go. So this reed is definitely not flat yet. And part of that is I do know my mouthpiece facing is flat. And if there's a chance that your mouthpiece may be off, and the way you can kind of check that is if you do buy like a kit or something like that, It comes just like a plexiglass thing. And you can kind of just check, kind of just dropping it in and seeing where it falls. And it should be even. Um, and even if you don't like line it up perfectly, you can generally tell, but you do want to make sure you're holding it firmly and not kind of just letting it sit there, because then it will, excuse me, just move by itself. Um, so if I know this reed is that I was just working on is not flat yet, then I will, and if I take this back to it, I can feel, and I generally don't use very much pressure the first time, but this time I'm just applying a bit more pressure. And as soon as I did, I could feel where it was uneven. And I do this before I play because there's no way that I'm going to be able to judge a reed if I don't know how it's playing. And the next step, I'm going to wet the reed. I'm going to show you some things to look for in a reed. And I kind of know how this reed plays, but I played it for about 25 seconds. So I basically did about what I would do on a first day playing it, but I'm going to adjust it early, earlier than I would normally do. And the reason we don't want to adjust the reed too early is reeds change during a break-in process. You know, somewhere between 4 and 10 days, depending on how patient I'm feeling that week or that box, or how much time I have to spend just breaking in the reeds, or how many reeds have seemed to have bit the bullet sooner. But I'm going to turn on this light and I will adjust it so you can see what we're looking for in a reed. Give me a second. There we go. So if I hold this up, if you can see, I mean, it's pretty bright. Usually there's just a general shape of a U, and it's exaggerated a bit just because this light is incredibly bright facing into the camera. But you just see the general shape, and it's thinner at the tip. And that's not quite what this one looks like to me, just because it's not that thin, but just visually I can see where this reed is a bit thicker and a bit thinner. So even before I may play it the very first day, before I know if it's hard, before it's soft, I will take this reed then. And the first one I was showing you, I actually know it was too soft, and judging from the number on the bottom, I knew it was going to be, because I knew the exact strength from D'Addario out of the factory. And so this one's a little bit hard. And one of the things I always check is we have the bark or the cuticle. And as we're working on a reed, I take the back of my fingernail, I just glide it along the edge at about a 45-degree angle on both sides. And this left side is okay, but I feel a little bit, and you can do the same thing along the bark. And what you want is, you don't want to feel the same thing on the front of the reed as you do at the bark. And this is the thing I find most common. Occasionally I have a stuffy reed or something like that, and I'll just take a ReedGeek and just very gently, because the sides of the reed are the most delicate, and the tip. I mean, if you put a gouge in the side of a reed, chances of it vibrating well have basically dropped, I don't want to say to zero, but you've taken a reed that could be good and kind of prevented that from happening. So we don't want to go too quickly here, but I can just feel it smooth. And I know this reed was actually a bit stuffy before. So I will just take this and then I'll run my finger along it without even playing. Because the truth is, even if this makes a reed ultimately a bit too soft, it wouldn't have mattered if it was the right strength but stuffy. So once I've tested that, I will then go back and for the rest of this process of reed work, as we're getting into it, this is about the extent of what I'll do on the first day, is just making sure the reed's flat, making sure there's no bark or cuticle. And it used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago that you would find a fair amount of that, and it could be very severe. Now, it really it's very slight, but I find it can be the difference between a really great reed and a reed that's a little iffy or okay. But that's the one thing that can turn an okay reed into uh, a real player. Um, so now the reed's on here. So it is not only soft but fuzzy, um, which is not a great combination. If that's what I experienced the first time playing on a reed, that would probably be a reed that I wouldn't necessarily be spending tons of time. But because we're doing that and I could feel which side was stuffier, which side was harder to blow on, I'm going to adjust it anyways. And so I'm going to my goal. I'm going to walk through working on a reed to make it playable. And in this case, my goal is to make it playable today, not necessarily making a reed last forever, because this is a process that I would work on after I broke in the reeds, maybe 3 4 days usually before I would really start working on them. And then over the next 4 days or so to a week, so it's about somewhere between a 7 and 11 day process. um, I would uh, keep working on the reeds. But so this side was harder, this left side. um, and so and just looking at it, I can kind of see where the cane is a bit more dense. And I'm barely touching right now. There's a process that we call it touch and blow. We don't really want to take a lot of material off. And I don't know if you can really tell. I'm not really, I don't know if you can see this. That's how much material I just moved. I'm not really taking much off right now. I'm being very delicate because I we can't ever add material back to a reed. Um, but we can certainly continue to take more off. So it'd be better to, on any given day, if you think you've made a little bit of a difference and it's improved a little bit, I would stop there. And as you saw, I really took very little off. And now I am going to play it again. I just balanced it ever so slightly. Um, and let us see. Yeah. This reed is still a bit fuzzy and a bit spitty. And I don't think it's me because there's no moisture on the mouthpiece. The reed is just not vibrating particularly well. So this is a reed that I would continue to work on over a few days. And today I can talk about where I would work on the reed and why I would choose those places. So uh, I'm going to afterwards I can attach this uh, book. It's actually published by Eastman that James Rotter wrote, my old professor. And it just talks about the different parts of the reed. Let's see if it'll go in there. Uh, and it's 40 some pages just as a PDF and a ReedGeek process. And he talks about conditioning reeds, um, and balancing the reeds. And you know, as other people put dots, put you know potential for a potential good reed. I'll put a G if it's just already a good reed. Um, I'll put dots, pluses, minuses, um, and the truth is, as you start to work on these, you will end up ruining some reeds. But this is a pretty good image. Instead of going just too far in depth, This image, I mean, I know just the other day there was a, let me see if I can get that. Is this readable for people? Maybe if maybe that's better. There we go. Um, this, and there's not tons of areas marked. And I know there was a graph put on a Facebook group the other day that had all these different parts that we're talking about. Um, and the truth is that there are very few parts of the reed that I'll really end up working on. I will work, as I talked about, the rails. Um, I'll even work at the very back, right where the cut is. If a reed is really stuffing the low register, I will work, let me see, there we go. I will work this part of the reed. And this part of the reed, we want it to be balanced. But then I'll work kind of the sides up here to make sure these are balanced and even. And then I will work the tip, make sure this is balanced, and just behind the tip. Um, and that's about it. And I would go, I don't think this is necessarily the right setting to go over exactly what we're working on for every single part of the reed. And partly because no matter what I say, you might not remember, and you are going to ruin reeds as soon as you start working on them. The nice thing about a ReedGeek is the likelihood of you ruining a reed is much slimmer than if you were using a reed knife, because the likelihood of you just gouging it like you could with a sharp blade is lower. Um, so part of it is just talking about how we use the motions we use. And as I'm doing it, as you can see, just a scraping motion. You know, a reed knife, you're doing this and rotating your wrist and trying to keep it balanced. And this, you can just kind of scrape. And uh, this is really very basic. I intend it to be basic. And after I'm done, I'm happy to open up the chat if people have questions. Uh, but it's really just about basic and about starting and balancing reeds. As we break in a reed, we want the reeds to last, and we want them to play optimally. And one thing I can say is that when I have a decent reed, as long as I'm keeping it in shape, it can last a very long time. If you play a reed and in the first week it's terrible, I have never made one of those a performance reed. I've made a reed that was like, into a really great practice reed that is not necessarily in a concert reed rotation, but it is in a practice rotation that is just used more often. Then I'll go through those a lot more quickly, using them, 3, 4 times a week, 5 times a week, um, as I change reeds throughout the day as I'm practicing and teaching. Um, and part of that process that I do for maintaining your reeds is usually polishing them, especially if I want my concert reeds to last a very long time. I will polish my reeds, and I will talk a bit more about that. Now, let me switch the camera. So to polish, I actually have this. You can use any sandpaper you want, a couple thousand grit. Um, this is a piece of 2500 grit sandpaper, and even this, just taking it, this won't really actually take off almost any material, and this reed is so new, it really will not do much. I'm just kind of mostly pushing forward, and as I go to the tip, I will only go forward from the tip. Back here, I will go back and forth, but as I get to the tip, I will only push forward because I don't want to break that tip. And even now, that is quite smooth already. I don't know if it's reflecting any light differently, but that turned into a very smooth, those pores are pretty closed. And you can do the same thing on the back side. Now, overall, this will seal pores. I don't spend this much time on reeds that aren't great, usually, or ever. It's if I want a reed to last. And so what I end up doing is I have this block, just a fairly firm block, and it came with these fabric. Like, I don't know if you can see the material, fabric sandpaper in them, and it starts at 1500 grit, and it goes down. I usually do not start at 1500 because I really don't want it at that point. I'm not trying to take off material, so I'll start somewhere between 3200 and 3600 grit, which is just incredibly fine. Um, this is 3600 grit. Uh, it doesn't really feel like sandpaper to the touch. Um, and then I'll just hold it in the block like this, and I will just go in this motion towards the tip. And because the block is soft, it will conform around the reed, and you can do it flatter. I usually do the edges. As you can see, you can see where the edge was, and that it is taking off some material, but that's also why I don't, that was 3600 grit. I don't use anything finer, is that I generally want to start with a reed that's slightly hard so I can work on it and uh, improve it. And these go up to 4000 and then 6000 grit. And there are actually finer grits that you can use, but I generally save this process for reeds that are really going to be concert and performance reeds. And I do keep separate reeds for concert and performance and practice, because honestly, I think it's a really great thing to practice on subpar reeds. That isn't to say, there are reeds that just don't respond and don't play, and you start doing weird things with your embouchure to try to compensate for a really bad reed. That's not good. But if the reed generally plays but isn't the most responsive in the low register, if you have to just make sure all of your air and everything else is, everything in your fingers, or everything is lining up and perfect to make this reed work, and then you go to a great reed that responds really well, it makes your performance that much more effortless, and you can do more. Um, so I go through that process of polishing my performance reeds. And what it does is it kind of stabilizes them. And when I keep them in humidity controlled reed cases, uh, they will, in this process of polishing them, that is when I'll have reeds that will last me 6 months, 8 months, a year, sometimes a year and a half, sometimes almost two, depending on how often I use it. And the truth is, there are reeds that um, my wife is from Japan, and so I go to Japan in the summer often. And in Tokyo, was it last summer? 2 summers ago, it was 99 degrees Fahrenheit. No, that's not right. It was 106 degrees Fahrenheit and 99% humidity. The feels like temperature was 116 degrees. Um, and if I wanted to play my saxophone, there are reeds that I could never use in Los Angeles when my office can be 3% humidity in the valley, uh, or 40. But there are reeds that work there in different strengths, and reeds that sound terrible here that I keep because they have certain qualities. And when I go over to Japan, it's like, wow, these reeds are great. So I don't necessarily, if a reed seems to be too soft or a little too hard, I don't necessarily get rid of it as long as it's balanced. Um, and I'll keep it just for those times where I travel to different altitudes, travel to different humidities, and I want to have a variety of reeds that work. And that's why I separate out my practice reeds and my performance reeds, because I have a box of performance reeds that are generally a bit hard. I have a box of performance reeds that are generally a bit soft, and ones that are really for where I am and where I live are very good for there. And then I have a box of teaching reeds, and usually in a synthetic or two in there, um, just depending in case the weather's awful, because I may travel 1,000 feet in altitude and a humidity difference of 30 or 40, 50% in one day here in Los Angeles. Um, but that's really the basics I do of reed work. And if you break it in slowly, if we play it slowly, just keep the back flat. And the truth is, every single day that I play, I will just make sure the back is flat. And does it take off some material? It does. So there are times when I choose not to do that, and I will just take a piece of paper and push the fibers back in. But generally speaking, um, if a reed's getting softer but it's still a good reed, that's when I'll do that. But generally speaking, I find that just taking off that tiny amount that has made it uneven, some swelling by the window, slight warping, is really minimized in a humidity controlled case, and really does lessen over time. So if I take the time to break in the reed, by the time I'm 10 days, 2 weeks into breaking in a reed, that if I I'm ready to go. And if I don't have any good reeds for some reason, I have a concert in 2 weeks, and I wait those 10 days, but it's really broken in, I find that I will still have a stable reed for a performance. Um, and so that's something important to note. I want to talk briefly about what we do when we have a reed that's too soft. There are various reed clippers out there, most of which, if they're cheap, like they see on Amazon or something like $4, I bought them just to check it out. I was curious if it was worth anything, and it's not worth the $4, even with free shipping. Um, the only good ones is if you find a Cordier one that the tip shape aligns to your mouthpiece, or like this Van Doren. These are great. Um, the reed I first started on today is still a 3 plus. It's a little bit soft. Um, but this is the only reed trimmer I will use. It's probably not actually soft enough to use this on. Um, but even all the way down, unfortunately, the D'Addario reeds are longer than Van Doren. So I don't know if I can hold this, if this will focus. Come on. Does it? It will. There we go. I don't know if you can see the reed sticking up there. Um, that's a fairly considerable amount of reed to take off the tip for a reed that was just a tad soft and a little bit buzzy. But this one, you just turn it and you're done. There's no, you can adjust it left, right, doing that. Uh, the thing about taking off a certain amount of material off the tip is that the length of the vamp, all these things matter for the proportions for tuning and all these other things. So I try to be very careful about when I do it, because I don't really want to remake a reed. But if a reed is really too soft, but it's still great, you can take a chance and do that. This reed was considerably soft. It felt more like a maybe a hard 3, but it was uh, not playing well. And so I probably should have played it before so you could have heard it. But now that I've clipped it, the reed does not feel particularly great. And I would actually even say that it may still be a tad softer feeling than I like. Um, but it's considerably, I could play on that reed if I had to. And so uh, something important to realize as we're working on reeds is sometimes it's not only about the balance of a reed, but how a reed feels. What's the sensation of the resistance of a reed? A reed could sound great, but it could be very difficult to play on. A reed could be um, very easy to play, not necessarily soft, but just very easy and responsive, but not have a beautiful sound. And as we're adjusting reeds, it's something I think is important to take into consideration, that I want reeds for different things. The reed I might use when I play an orchestra might be a different reed than I would use for playing um, Barrio or Albright. That's going to be different than pictures at an exhibition. Uh, the reed that I play for hard or grab it or whatever I'm doing is going to be a different reed that I'm going to pick for Prokofiev in orchestra. And that sometimes there's reeds that do everything. That they'll play low B flat, low B, 3/4 Ps effortlessly, and they will play your double altissimo Gs or higher, and everything just comes out. And the reed doesn't sound bad, but it's not a beautiful sounding reed. But sometimes that's okay. So as we're balancing a reed, it's important to think about our reed work as we're not always trying to make a beautiful sounding reed, but we're trying to make a functional reed. And there are days when you show up somewhere, you're trying to get work done, and it's an older reed or it's a reed that you never really liked, but you need a reed that day, and your good reeds that you know are good are not working. You can take a bad reed and you can just work on it that day. And you take off a lot more material than you normally would until it's balanced and done. And Ken Radnofsky used to do that in my lessons for him on occasion when I had really bad reeds. And Joe Allard would do it for him. And one of the problems with making a reed perfect for that day in one sitting is invariably, and the reason it worked for Joe Allard is because he was playing in orchestras, doing these gigs, and you need a reed that day. No matter what it is, you need a reed that works that day. So it'll work that day, and then I've invariably found that by the next day, or even later in that day, sometimes it was done. It was too soft. It was didn't play, but for the 30 minutes to an hour that I needed a reed to work, I had adjusted it perfectly that day. Um, so there are times we can do that, and that's can be a good thing to practice, especially on not a great reed. See if you can make that reed great that day, and see if it works another day. But overall, I like to make this a longer term uh, thing where you're trying to make a reed for a month, 2 months. And by the way, a month is not a very long time for a reed to last, unless you're only rotating 4 to 8 reeds. If you're really practicing, I generally have I don't know where I put my reed case. Right here. Um, you know, at the very minimum on any given day, I will probably have at least 8 reeds in a rotation. Um, and that's because I try, even when a reed's broken in, unless it's a recital where I'm playing the entire time, I'll try to pick or have multiple options for two different halves through intermission, um, or um, maybe it can play for an hour, but generally speaking, I won't go more than an hour on any single reed because we don't want to just soak the reed and it just starts the fibers start to break down because it's a natural material. Um, and I have some reed blanks here, and I don't know if you can. I mean, all the bark is still here, and the bottom. I don't know if this will show the texture of the bottom. It is quite rough. Um, it isn't flat, and uh, you can even see the grain from more of the inside of the splits. So when they split the cane into 4 pieces and then they flatten the bottom, this also is not a very good um, reed. I don't know if you can see the heel. This is never going to end up being a kind of a really balanced reed. It is just too uneven, uh, at least at that end. I suppose you could make, yeah. Um, but we want to balance reeds out. And the slower the process you go in working on your reeds and balancing them, the longer your reeds will last. And the less you play your reeds on any given day, the longer they'll ultimately last. So the break-in process being at least 4, 5, 6, 7 days, up to 11 days. And if you're working on reeds and you're trying to get ready for something even further away or make them really last, my ultimate break-in process could be a month long, where I'm not even going to play them every day. Every 3 days I'll take it out, play it a little bit, see if there's something I want to adjust. I make a note down on a piece of paper with the marking on the reed, so I know which one it was, and then I put it away. And then when I play it 3 days later, I do the same thing. I'll play it, write down what I thought about the reed, right next to it. Is it the same thing? Is it different? And then I compare to see if it's a normal way a reed will play, or if it is a that day it happened to play differently. And then from there I go and I continue to adjust the reed. Um, I don't know if there was something that I missed or didn't cover, but I really just wanted to cover kind of basics of how we're working on reeds, and how to break them in and how I start it, just so that we can make more reeds for us. Because I remember as an undergrad when I was not good at this, and I would just go through boxes of reeds, and a recital would be coming, and I'd be praying that I would find a reed that played, and I would, and then a week later, because I would just play it on it all the time, my recital would be getting closer, and it wouldn't play, and I wouldn't know why. And usually I had a good reed for things, but it was just a process of always being frustrated, and it never felt good. Uh, so I think even for me, 15 years later, reeds are more consistent. Um, and sure, there are times on any brand where you get one, two, three boxes that they're not good. And it could just be the weather of that growing season where the reeds were made. But they're fairly consistent. But understanding the basics of how we work on reeds become very, I think, important to making these reeds last. Let me go over to this chat and see what the, oh, just a thank you. Um, uh, was Were there any questions about reed work or anything you'd like me to? How much adjusting do you? So Jacob asked, when balancing a reed, how much adjusting do you do by feel versus visually? Do you try to make it look balanced before doing anything else, or do you play the rails and balance based on how that feels? Um, when you're starting, if you don't know what you're feeling for, like when I first started, it's like, oh, that feels the same. I could not tell. So no matter what, I will look at it. And the trick, the reeds nowadays are fairly well cut, so they should be an even cut left right across the reed, unless the heel is just a little too uneven for that to happen. That being said, maybe the left side ends up being a little thicker and the right side more, the cane is more dense. It's a natural product that can happen. So I kind of do a little bit, I look at it to get an idea, but then I still, I go by feel and then I play. Um, the uh, it's really a balance of them, but I really prefer to do it on how it's playing, and I do a lot of it visually, but I would say for reads that, especially that I'm trying to break in for a long period of time, it is a balance. I look at it, um, and part of that is I know that reads that have a random dark spot somewhere in there where I don't want one, I have just generally found that that dense material there, depending as other factors out of our control change, the reeds don't end up playing as well. So I try to do a bit of both, but if it feels good on both sides, you can either turn your mouthpiece or just turn your head, and use feel to adjust it. I do both, um, but above everything, I would say the feel is most important. How are, there are places that reed companies would never send a reed that looked like that. I mean, because it is, maybe that one's still okay, but it's not a pure enough color. And there's places that people play, places where people only play reeds that are visually good. Like this China reed's fine. It's a bit cleaner looking, you know. So, but I don't care how ugly the back of the reed is, or I don't care that stuff. But generally speaking, a well balanced reed usually is pretty good visually and to the feel, but definitely feel and sound is the most important. Um, and the rails, I don't, the rails themselves, when I'm first starting that process of checking the rails themselves, that is only by feel, because stuffiness in your playing can come from other parts of the reeds or some fuzz in the playing. But so that's why that's the first thing I check to remove, because that's the one that it can be other places. So I try to remove that factor, um, and then I can adjust. Um, I can adjust the other parts of the reed that are, um, can affect stuffiness or how vibrant the reed is. Um, let me go up. Uh, Nathan, what humidity do you prefer to store your reeds at? Um, I don't know. I think it just depends on what is had. These are at 72. Um, in the past, I've done 68 or 69. I just ordered the 10 pack designed for cigars from Boveda. It's and the 8 gram pack, and it just fits in. If I'm in a very humid place, I'll put a lower humidity thing in there, and it just depends on people's saliva. I've had students at 72% humidity that are like, "Oh, in 4 days I had mold growing on my reeds," and in which case, if that's the case for you, then I would go to a lower humidity level, or if it's constantly happening, I would, our saliva can have different sugars in it and other things. You could consider using an alcohol sponge or something to help prevent that, but uh, I generally do about somewhere between 68 and 72. I may go lower if I'm at someplace very humid, just to so the reeds don't just hold too much humidity, even though the humidity pack should pull that humidity out. Um, so what equipment should a person have? Sorry, Andrew. So what equipment should a person have to do the reed work you do? Just a ReedGeek and a variety of fine sandpapers and a soft block. Um, I would even say that uh, just a ReedGeek is mostly enough. To do everything I do, I would say you want something flat to work with. If you get a ReedGeek and get the set, this plaque, this can be your flat surface, and one side is square and one side is reed shaped. Generally speaking, not really, but block my face out. Um, this would be enough to kind of do most of what I do on. If you have other things, here is, I have this Van Doren glass, and the benefit to this would be that also you can make sure that the um, the table is flat using this, and the little glass reed brush that it comes with, you can adjust the rails with this too. Um, the minimum is some flat surface that you can work on. So uh, if you just want to make sure it's actually flat glass. Um, and this is actually pretty thick. You don't want it to be flexing even during reed work, because um, it's just, it makes your life difficult. But plexiglass, a piece of flat glass, you want something flat to work on. A ReedGeek, and yeah, I would say fine sandpapers are, but you don't necessarily need the soft block. It's just something that I one time ordered it as a set, and I was like, oh, that's nice. And so um, it was cheaper to order it with the block every single time than to just get the sandpaper um, that I wanted. But that being said, if I just get a giant block of sandpaper, just regular paper, that can be cheaper too. Um, for flattening the reed, you do need a ReedGeek. For most of what I do, though, you could use just sandpaper. You could take the edge of the reed and just use sandpaper on that to work your reed, to take off any cuticle or bark running down the rails, to balance it. You can do that with sandpaper, and a lot of people do. I just find it less accurate and more difficult. The ReedGeek will give you kind of this radius area that you can do more gentle adjustments, a little tip here that you can do fine work and kind of take things out. So I would say at minimum a flat work surface. I would use a ReedGeek. I think they're great products. I have one in every single saxophone case in my clarinet bag. I think I have 7, because I also have one at home and one in my office. Is that right? Yeah, I have 7. I may have 8. But I leave them everywhere, so I always have one with me, and my reads have been much more consistent since I started doing that. The process of, if you don't want to do the sandpaper, you don't need to. You can just use regular paper and your fingers, as other people have. But yeah, I would say a ReedGeek, a flat working surface, and fine sandpaper at the very least. Um, the block or other things are up to you. But yeah, that's actually a pretty good um, kit. Um, Matthew, I've found that Van Doren 3.5 is too hard, and D'Addario 3 Plus too soft for alto. What other option would you recommend? Um, I would try different cuts. I have a feeling it could be the cut that's maybe not quite right for you. So if the Van Doren 3.5 was uh, a blue box or V21 or V12, you could try one of the others. Um, they're and for everyone, I know people that hate playing on D'Addario and say they're stuffy or this or and Van Dorens are inconsistent, and so you have to just find what works for you. And for me, the D'Addarios and usually three plus, 3.5, depending on the weather, depending on the week. I don't know. Um, I usually keep two or three strengths around. So if you found those too hard, you could try the D'Addario uh, 3 plus or 3.5. But you could also try. I think they still have like the Grand Concert Selects. You could try. Um, you can try other cuts, um, but um, I think if you find something that's a little hard, that's easier to work with. As long as it's not too hard, I would always recommend going something that's a unless you're finding that you're having to bite really hard as you're breaking them in. I would recommend going a little harder than a little soft because it's we can always take off a little bit more material. Um, and as we were talking in the break-in process, we want our reeds to last. If you know you're starting on a reed that's going to be too hard and you play it and it's too hard the very first day, every single day you play it, I would not, I would unabashedly just flatten the back and it will just take off a little bit more material. So by the time you're done breaking it in, that reed will be softer. It's not a large amount of material, but the reed overall will be softer. And then as you're ready to make sure it's balanced, you're just working with a little bit less material. So I would either take the 3.5 of the Van Doren or maybe the 3.5 of the D'Addario, and in your break-in process, I would flatten it very regularly before you start for the day, when you finish, before you put it away, double check it when you take it back out. Uh, and that way you're just taking off a little bit of material and the reed that you're working with overall is a bit softer. Um, are there any other questions here? I think that's all I am seeing. So I know it's a little after or just about one, I think. Is that right? Um, so if there's no more questions, I think I will end it. But if anyone has any reed questions, and I'll post the book and some ReedGeek articles just about working reeds and how you use it, and I'll post the whole book. Um, and it is I have it as a PDF. It is a free book, but it was put out by Eastman. I think it's a good guide, and it's just a background on how to work on reeds, even though I don't work on them in the same way. I think it just gives you a lot of information. So I'll post those when the video gets posted over into the Facebook group. And if any of you have questions about reed work, feel free to send me a message and I'd be happy to talk more in depth about things. I didn't want to go too deep on other things I do, but really just basic working techniques and how I keeping the reed flat is 90% of what I do. So I just wanted to do that. Feel free to send me an email or Facebook message or anything, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions. And thank you, everyone, for listening to me. I think this is the first time I've ever done a presentation at a blank screen, but uh, it's I hope it's been helpful and informative. And thank you, everyone, for coming.